What if I told you that poverty is natural, that inequality is necessary, that helping the weak actually harms society? You'd probably reject that. But what if, somewhere deep inside you, you believe it? At least a little. When you think someone deserves their success, when you assume failure is a personal flaw, when you tell yourself the world is simply competitive, you're brushing against an idea that reshaped empires, justified inequality, and influenced some of the darkest chapters in modern history. An idea that dressed itself as science. Social Darwinism. The belief that society evolves the way nature does, and that only the fittest deserve to survive. But to understand social Darwinism, we need to start with something much older and much more scientific. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. In it, he proposed a radical idea. Species evolve over time through natural selection. Organisms with traits better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and to reproduce. Over generations, those traits spread. It was a biological theory, a description of how life changes, not a moral rulebook. But soon, others began to take Darwin's ideas and stretch them far beyond biology. One of them was Herbert Spencer. Spencer didn't just admire Darwin. He believed evolution applied to everything, to societies, economies, even entire civilizations. He coined a phrase that would become infamous: survival of the fittest. But here's the crucial shift. In nature, fitness simply means the ability to adapt to an environment. It doesn't mean strongest. It doesn't mean richest. It doesn't mean morally superior. Yet in the late 19th century, as industrial capitalism exploded and wealth gaps widened, many began to interpret fitness in a very different way. The rich were fit. The poor were unfit. Success became proof of superiority. Failure became evidence of weakness. And that's when evolution stopped being just a scientific theory and started becoming an ideology. That ideology found fertile ground in a world already changing at terrifying speed. Factories were rising, cities were swelling, millions were leaving farms for industrial labor. Some became unimaginably wealthy. Others worked 16-hour days in dangerous conditions, barely surviving. The question haunted the 19th century. Why such extreme inequality? For social Darwinists, the answer was simple. It wasn't injustice, it wasn't exploitation, it wasn't flawed systems. It was nature. They argued that competition in the marketplace was no different from competition in the wild. Businesses that failed were simply unfit. Workers who remained poor lacked ability or discipline. Helping them, through welfare or labor protections, would only weaken society. William Graham Sumner, a prominent American advocate, put it bluntly: if you intervene to help the unfit, you interfere with natural progress. In this view, compassion became dangerous, reform became unnatural, inequality became inevitable, and the logic didn't stop at economics. It expanded outward, to nations. If individuals competed, then nations competed too. If some nations dominated others, that must mean they were more advanced, more evolved. Colonial expansion was reframed not as conquest, but as destiny. Entire populations were labeled primitive. Entire continents were described as less developed on an evolutionary ladder that didn't actually exist. What began as a biological observation was now being used to rank human beings. And once you begin ranking human beings, the consequences escalate. By the early 20th century, social Darwinist thinking merged with another growing movement: eugenics. If society progresses by eliminating weakness, some argued, why wait for nature to do it slowly? Why not intervene? Across the United States and parts of Europe, laws were passed allowing the forced sterilization of people labeled unfit: the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, minorities. The justification was chillingly clinical. It was framed as science, as improvement, as progress. Tens of thousands were sterilized without consent. And in its most extreme form, these ideas fed directly into the racial ideology of Nazi Germany. There, evolution was twisted into a brutal myth of racial hierarchy. The state did not just refuse to help the weak, it actively sought to eliminate them. It's important to be precise here. Darwin's theory did not call for genocide. Biology does not demand cruelty. But once the language of fitness and natural selection is detached from science and attached to power, it becomes incredibly dangerous. Because if inequality is natural, if hierarchy is biological, then oppression can be framed as inevitable. And if something is inevitable, it no longer feels immoral. That was the real power of social Darwinism. It didn't just justify inequality, it made it feel natural. So why was this idea so persuasive? Because it offered something extremely comforting to those at the top. If you are wealthy, powerful, successful, social Darwinism tells you that you deserve it. Not because of luck, not because of structural advantage, not because of historical circumstance, but because you are fit. And if others struggle, that struggle becomes proof, not of injustice, but of inferiority. It transforms complex social systems into simple moral narratives, winners and losers, strong and weak, fit and unfit. It removes ambiguity, it removes responsibility, and perhaps most importantly, it removes guilt. But there was a fundamental flaw at its core. Evolution describes what is. It does not prescribe what ought to be. In nature, earthquakes kill thousands. Predators tear prey apart. Disease spreads without mercy. But we do not look at a hurricane and say, this is morally correct. We don't call suffering good simply because it occurs in nature. Social Darwinism blurred that line. It took a descriptive theory and turned it into a moral justification. Philosophers call this mistake the naturalistic fallacy, the assumption that because something is natural, it is therefore right. Modern evolutionary biology also dismantles the simplistic reading of survival of the fittest. Cooperation is a survival strategy. Empathy has evolutionary roots. Human societies thrive not just through competition, but through collaboration. In fact, our species survived largely because we learned to protect the vulnerable. So the story becomes more complicated. If evolution includes cooperation, if societies flourish through mutual support, then the idea that cruelty equals progress begins to collapse. And yet, echoes of social Darwinism still linger, not in textbooks labeled as such, but in everyday language. When we say someone deserves poverty, when we treat success as proof of moral worth, when we frame life purely as competition, the language has softened, the ideology often hides, but the underlying question remains: is inequality a flaw in our systems, or simply the natural order of things? And how we answer that question still shapes the world we build. Today, almost no one openly calls themselves a social Darwinist. The term is associated with extremism, racism, and historical catastrophe. It carries too much weight. But ideas rarely disappear. They evolve. In modern culture, the language has changed. We speak of meritocracy, of hustle, of grinding harder, of winners and losers. We celebrate disruption. We admire dominance. We treat the market as an impartial judge. And sometimes, without realizing it, we slip into a familiar logic. If you failed, you didn't adapt. If you're struggling, you're not competitive enough. If you can't keep up, you're replaceable. The system becomes nature. The market becomes evolution. And inequality becomes evidence. But real societies are not ecosystems in the wild. Markets are designed. Laws are written. Institutions are constructed. They reflect choices, human choices. When we naturalize inequality, we stop questioning those choices. And that may be the most lasting legacy of social Darwinism. Not the slogans, not the textbooks, but the quiet assumption that hierarchy is inevitable, that the world must have winners and losers, that helping others somehow interferes with progress. Yet history shows us something different. The greatest leaps in human well-being, public health, labor rights, education, social safety nets, came not from abandoning the vulnerable, but from protecting them. Civilization advanced not by eliminating weakness, but by redefining strength. So perhaps the real question isn't whether society is competitive. It clearly is. The question is, what do we choose to reward? What do we choose to protect? And who do we decide is worth saving? Darwin explained how life changes over time. Social Darwinism tried to explain who deserves to rise and who deserves to fall. One is science. The other is a story we tell ourselves about power. And like all powerful stories, it shapes the future, whether we recognize it or not.